This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Welcome back, everybody. It's Wednesday, December 11th, 2024. On this date in 1919, the Boll Weevil Monument was dedicated in downtown Enterprise. Now, born on this date in 1926, Big Mama Thornton of Ayrton. You may have heard her original pre-Elvis version of Hound Dog. In 1978, Roy Wood Jr., who was born in New York City but raised in Birmingham and famously embraces it as his hometown. Today on the show, we have Atlanta Braves play-by-play broadcaster Brandon Gaudin. He grew up a Superstation kid like so many of us, which drew him to baseball and the Braves. So we'll talk a little nostalgia there, as well as the craft of sports announcing. We'll also talk about how he came to become the voice of Madden NFL, the video game. First, though, we'll do some news updates. My name's Ike Morgan, and we're down in Alabama. If you've been paying attention for any length of time at all, you know not to bet your 401k on a government building being built on time and on budget. In the case of the future Alabama State House, though, it's being built by Retirement Systems of Alabama, RSA, to be leased to the state. Still, RSA CEO David Bronner said that construction is 4 to 6 months behind, reports AL.com's Mike Kaysen. Bronner said they're still hoping to stick to a target of having the facility ready for the 2027 legislative session. And because early in the process they were coming in under budget, they're still on track to stay within the $325 million cost estimate. Now, Bronner does have his concerns about construction costs going forward. He specifically singled out President-elect Trump's promised tariffs, which would almost certainly add to the cost of materials. So, does this all matter to you if you don't work at the State House and you don't have your retirement with the RSA? Well, it does if you're a taxpayer. When the RSA leases the building to the legislature, it'll be earning an 8% return on investment from the state per the contract. The state's been talking about improving or replacing the State House for years. Lawmakers have been working out of a retrofitted building since 1985. It's leaky and moldy and not disability friendly. And 2 years ago, engineers determined that if the legislature stayed in that old building, it would require $51 million in work over the next 10 years. So, after the new State House is done, plans are to demo the old building and develop a parking deck and park area. The U.S. Army has fired 4-star General Charles Hamilton, who led the Army Material Command at Huntsville's Redstone Arsenal, reports AL.com's Howard Koplowitz. According to Military.com, it's the first time in 2 decades the Army has fired a 4-star general outright. The Army said Hamilton inappropriately tried to persuade an assessment board to give a command assignment to a female lieutenant colonel. According to documents, he was successful in getting her a second interview even after her recommendation had been voted down 5-0, but his efforts did not ultimately result in an assignment. Alabama Power announced that next year customers can expect to pay less on their bill, reports AL.com's Howard Koplowitz. Now for you, of course, that depends on your usage not going wild if you plan on installing a theater or stadium lights in your yard. During the first quarter, most customers will see several dollars cut because of a $96 million lawsuit judgment against the federal government over a breach of contract dispute with Alabama Power regarding the removal of spent nuclear fuel. Over the entire year, there'll be a smaller cut that Alabama Power attributes to lower fuel prices. The utility estimates a 1.88% decrease for customers. Hey, speaking of the power bill, let's take a quick ad break so we can keep the lights on here. Then we're going to talk with sports broadcaster Brandon Gaudin. Y'all stay with us.
How do you feel great on vacation? Like really good? Easy. You go to Aruba. You'll spend your time relaxing on cool white sand beaches and floating in healing blue water. You'll immerse yourself in natural wonder and find your center on an island where things move at your speed. You won't just feel great, you'll feel relaxed, renewed, and ready for life. That's the Aruba effect. Plan your trip at Aruba.com.
Time to move? Skip the hassles of selling during the holiday season and sell your home directly to Opendoor. Request an all-cash offer in minutes, close, and get paid in days. You can even pick your close date so you can move after New Year's. Start your move at Opendoor.com or download the Opendoor app. Opendoor is represented by Opendoor Brokerage Inc., license 02061130 in California, and Opendoor Brokerage LLC in its other markets. Terms and conditions apply.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Alabama is obviously Braves country for geographic reasons, but it's Braves country even more so because of the old Ted Turner Superstation. Now, many of you grew up on the Superstation, and you have your Ginsu knives to prove it. To y'all and to me, Skip Carey, Pete Van Wieren, Ernie Johnson, and the rest of the guys, Don and Joe, they've been like, as familiar as family. A series of dizzying network changes and rebrandings later, we still have our Braves broadcast crew. And I know we've spent the past 2 seasons with accomplished sports broadcaster Brandon Gaudin in the play-by-play role. Well, I'm thrilled to have Brandon on the Down in Alabama podcast today. Welcome to the virtual studio, Brandon.
Thanks for having me, Ike. And yeah, I'm sure we'll get into it. But anytime someone mentions the Superstation, I can't help but smile because that was my childhood. Even though I was in Southern Indiana, that was my childhood through and through.
Yeah, let's talk about that. You've made it clear that you were a Braves fan growing up in Evansville, and I wanted to know, did that kind of start with the worst to first 1991 season, or how did you come to the Braves? I obviously the Superstation was a big part of it.
Yeah, it really was. And it wasn't that I was a bandwagon fan, excuse me, that jumped on in 91. It was that I was 7 years old. And that was really the first year, for a lot of kids that you can really grasp what's going on with sports and truly following a team. And they were on TBS every night. And so I just gravitated to the Braves as so many fans did, excuse me, around the country. For me, I had an aunt and uncle that were living in Atlanta. And so I knew that, hey, if the Braves caught on here, we might be able to go down and see a game or two. So in particular, though, 91 was the first season that I really started to lock in on them. And it's not only how I fell in love with the Braves, it's how I fell in love with the game of baseball in general. And then it's how I fell in love with broadcasting. So it really fostered all of those things for me as a young child. And through those 4 announcers that you mentioned, and in particular for me, since I knew I wanted to do play-by-play, listening to Skip Carey, he became the guy that I tried to emulate as I was 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then when I really got into high school and said, okay, I'd like to maybe try this truly as a career, he was the voice that was always in my head. And it still is the voice in my head now as I get to call the Braves games throughout the summer on a nightly basis.
That's interesting to think of you hearing his voice. We're kind of similar. I'm a little older. I was 8 years old in 1982 when the Braves had a resurgence here, and I just happened to start watching. They happened to start winning. Different group of people. Still, Skip and Pete and Ernie were among the broadcasters there.
Yep. Don, Joe, Skip, and Pete, those were the 4. And what's unique back then, Ike, and I know you probably remember this, is they would do half the game on radio and half the game on TV, and they would flip. So you would get to hear all 4 voices every night on the Superstation. The way that television works now, that's just not really feasible. Things have changed. Television has advanced so much since then that really wouldn't be as possible today. But it was for my childhood and for you watching those games as well. I loved it, and it was magical. And even though Skip was the one that I gravitated towards because he was the lead play-by-play announcer, all of those guys had such an impact on me. And what is so special for me now, one of the many things about this job that are so special, is that in the booth next door to me, working the radio games with Ben Ingram, is Joe Simpson on most nights. And I was nervous to meet Joe when I got the job last year because to me, those four guys were larger than life. And I had met Skip when I was a kid. I had never met Joe. And it was really cool. And I told him what an honor it was to meet him before last season when I took on this role because he had such a big impact on my childhood and why I am where I am today.
That's great you got to do that. Meeting Skip as a kid. I mean, what was that like? Do you remember what he said or?
Well, first I wrote him a letter, and I never really thought that he would reply. I didn't know if the letter would get to him. You know, you get it, especially back then, you don't have the internet. You get some generic address and you send it into Turner Broadcasting, and you're thinking that this thing will get lost in the mailroom. But I checked. I was 13 when I wrote the letter, and I would check the mailbox every day to see if he wrote back. And I remember going out there one day after school, and sure enough, one day I pulled out, it was a white letter, had the letterhead Turner Broadcasting on it, and I said, holy cow, this is it. There was nothing in that letter, and I still have it. It's actually just a few feet from me. There's nothing in that letter that was earth-shattering, right? It was the classic kind of cliche advice that someone in Skip's shoes would give to a 13-year-old kid who really isn't in the profession. But the fact that he wrote to me made him real. I used the term larger than life earlier, and that's kind of what Skip was. He was almost not real to me. He was this guy in a foreign land down in Atlanta that was on the television. But when he wrote me a letter and I had something tangible that he had written, that he had signed, it made him real, and it kind of fueled my desire to one day try to follow in his footsteps, kind of fueled that desire even more. And so that letter is something that I have always kept with me. I will always keep with me. He had the wherewithal, I guess, to not only put his letter, but he wrote or put my original letter in the envelope with him. So I have both of those, the one that I wrote and the one that he replied with. And those are letters that I will obviously cherish for the rest of my life.
Skip was absolutely a legend. Among the many memories are the way he would sort of poke fun at the Superstation, the movie that was coming on after the Braves game. I remember that. It would be some freebie that Turner was able to play like 50 times. Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, movies like that. And I think that sense of humor, he brought himself into the booth, and that was him. He was sly, he was sarcastic, and I imagine having a Coca-Cola with Skip would be a lot like listening to him on the ball game. And I think you guys are very real in your booth. I think there is a genuine, at least there seems to be a real genuine enthusiasm. And I say it seems to be because how much work is that to get to that place? Or is it a matter of just trying to relax?
Well, first, the thing sometimes with these jobs where you're a team announcer, quote unquote, is if, let's say I would have taken the A's job or the Giants job, those would have been wonderful jobs, but I would have had to sort of fall in love with the franchise or the fan base. With the Braves, I had fallen in love with them at age 7 and have been in love with them ever since. So there was a part to the marriage to me that just felt very natural. Now, there's also that aspect that you're talking to about getting to know the guys with you in the booth. And obviously, I work with several partners, but in my first season 2 years ago, the lion's share of those games were with Jeff Francoeur. Last year, Jeff, because he's got 4 kids at a young age and his wife wanted him to be home a little bit more, he backed down to doing about 30 games, and CJ Nitkowski came over from the Texas Rangers. And so 2 different guys that I was paired with for most of the games with 2 different styles. But you kind of hit the nail on the head, Ike. When I watch a ball game or when somebody else watches a ball game, I think the common thread you always hear people say is, I want to feel like I'm sitting on the couch with them. I want to feel like it's a conversation. I'm not being talked down to. I'm not being lectured. And that is kind of the approach that I try to take. And I realize I like to hear the analysts. So there's a lot of times where I don't say much, and even on big plays, I try to get out of the way quickly to give the analysts a chance to break it down because I want it to be a back and forth. And I want that to be a two-way street that really comes through. And the other thing I would say, Ike, is what I remember from watching Skip, and you were kind of alluding to it, is those guys had fun. This should be a fun job. Now, look, if the Braves are losing 12-0 in the fourth inning, I get it. It's tough. A lot of people are angry, but they don't want to hear us pile on and be negative and be down. This is a job that is a privilege to do, a privilege to hold. And I enjoy Braves baseball. And so for me, having fun up there and trying to implement some humor and some jabs with my broadcast partner, to me, that's all part of the experience. And that's a way that I'm going to continue to try to do it until they tell me to not do it anymore.
That's funny because that was almost right down the middle of another question I had, and I'm going to ask it anyway because I think you can flush it out a little bit. CJ Nitkowski, who seems very analytical and has this great dry sense of humor. And then you've got Fran Coor, who is more, a lot more, sounds way more social and more of a free spirit. I love the balance that you've had with both of them. Do you have to approach it differently with different guys? Because you've worked with an NFL, football, college basketball. You've worked with so many guys. Do you have to approach different guys in a different way, or does it just kind of fall in together magically?
Yeah. Well, and I think that the good thing about working other sports is I was sort of trained to work with different announcers. You're right. Throughout my last decade of calling games with football, with basketball, and baseball, it's rare. Like for the games that I do for Fox, it's rare that I'm working with the same announcer on back-to-back events. So this last week, I was at Connecticut on Wednesday for basketball with Bill Raftery. Saturday, I was at St. John's with Donnie Marshall. And then yesterday, I was at Purdue with Robbie Hummel. So it's 3 games in 5 days with 3 different announcers. Now, I've worked with those guys before, but before I go into each of those broadcasts, I remember they all have different strengths. They're all fantastic at what they do, and they're doing it at the highest level. But I want to cater to their strengths. That's my job. I'm driving the bus. I want to put them in a good position. People want to hear their expert analysis. I'm not the expert. I'm there to provide context, give big voice on an exciting call, add a storyline to a player. But when it comes to the X's and O's, that's their job. And that's how I look at it with the Braves, whether it's CJ Nitkowski, whether it's Jeff Francoeur, whether it's Tom Glavine. These guys are where they're at for a reason. They're darn good at what they do. And it's my job to put them in the best spots. Frenchie, yes. I mean, his personality is larger than life. He relies heavily on humor. And he obviously talks from a hitter's perspective and a fielder's perspective. CJ sees it from a pitcher's perspective because that's what he was, that's what he is. And he has a drier sense of humor, like you said. So, but I like that. I like the change of pace. They all have their strengths that, to me, make it fun. But the bottom line is that they're all pros. And so they make my job easier. So somebody I remember recently asked me, gosh, do you prefer one over the other? And it's not cliche. It's really just, I don't. I just enjoy working with all of them. And they're great human beings. And they love Braves baseball. And as I was saying earlier, put somebody in that chair next to me. Tom Glavine obviously does. Smoltz does. That loves Braves baseball. And we get to talk to Braves country every night. That's a win no matter what. So there are nuances and subtle differences, Ike, but I enjoy the challenge of working with each guy.
Now, when they do these games, for the audience who maybe don't watch every night, what's wrong with you? But also, and they bring in the former players, the 4-man booth. They might have had 5 in there once with Smoltz, Glavine, Chipper, Frenchie, McCann, I think, did a game. I mean, it gets wild. It's such a great watch. But how twitchy do you get? Do you sit at home and think, or not at home, wherever you are, and think, say the score, say the score?
No, I really don't. When they did the first one 2 years ago and the Braves walked it off against the Mets, it was the perfect storm. It was the first time they had done it. It was an electric game, obviously a fantastic finish. Ozzie Albies hit the game-winning homer into the chop house. And I watched that game just behind me on my couch. And I remember a lot of people text me saying, do you wish you were there? Do you wish you were there? And, you know, I don't think this is the wrong answer. No, not because I didn't want to call the game. Sure, I'll call any Braves game I can. Yeah. But I felt like I was a kid again. I felt like I was a kid again listening to Smoltz, listening to Glavine, guys that I grew up watching. chipper. And even though Frenchie and I are the same age, I remember watching Frenchie 06, 07 when I was getting into college and out of college, and he was starting to become a Major League Baseball player. So I felt like a kid again. And I think that what they've done with those broadcasts is right. You do 10 or 15 of those a year, it's probably too many and it loses its luster. You do a couple of them, one in the first half, one in the second half, and the fans love it. I think it's the right amount. And I just enjoy sitting back and watching them. And the last thing I will say is, if you watch those broadcasts, you know they're different from our normal broadcasts for a number of reasons. Not only because there's 4 in the booth and a couple of guys that aren't normally there, but also they roll in a lot of tape from back in the glory days. And that takes a lot of work and effort. And our producer, Gretchen Caney, is a mastermind. And she really is the driving force behind that 4-man booth and what has made it so successful. So there were a lot of ideas that went into those that will continue to go into those. But I think mixing the current game, also throwing in some of the old tape and the funny highlights, that's where the magic elixir is. And Gretchen and our crew did such an amazing job of that.
Yeah, I hear you call her name quite a bit on the telecast. That's obviously speaks well of her. I wanted to ask you, so we were talking about guys you've worked with. Let's put those guys aside for just a second, because I don't want to put you on the spot with any of them. But among the all-time greatest sportscasters, I just wanted to get you on the record. Who's at the top of your list?
Boy, so I'll just say I'm not just saying this because I'm talking Braves with you. Skip Carey is always going to be my number one because it's the voice of my childhood. It's the voice of the first 30 years of my life. And that's why I'm in the business, because of watching him. So that's always number one. But if you're asking me, look around the landscape and think who are guys to emulate, and I'm going to go on the television side of things, I still think Joe Buck, Jim Nantz, Mike Tirico, and Al Michaels, they're at the top of the craft for a reason. I think sometimes with TV, it's tough to know the right balance of talking too much, laying out, which means being silent. And I think those guys are more old school. And when I say old school, what I appreciate about that is they don't overtalk. They use 4 words instead of 6. They use 6 words instead of 10. And I think that is, at least that's my taste of broadcasting as a viewer. Some people may disagree, and that's fine. It's a subjective industry. But when I listen to those guys, they talk the right amount. They do the right amount of stories versus play-by-play versus letting their analysts talk. It's such a tap dance. It really is such a tap dance. And you really have to listen to your partner, because that's what we were talking about earlier, Ike, about you want it to feel like you're on the couch with your partner and the listener that is watching at home is there with you. And they're eavesdropping on your conversation. And if your partner is saying something and you're not locked in, you're just ready to go to your next nugget or the next story that you've got. To me, and it's easy to do that as a play-by-play announcer, and I know that I've failed and done that many times, but that's where you get in trouble. If Frenchie's telling a story about a game from back in 2010, I want to be locked into what he's saying, and I want a follow-up question. Or then how do I parlay that into talking about, okay, Frenchie, tell me how that would play out today. If he says that, and then I just go into, and here's Ozzie Albies 2-1 pitch, then it's almost like we're on 2 separate tracks, on 2 different trains. And I always want to be on the same train. And so that is something that we've kind of hit on it a lot, that I try to do, and I see in those 4 announcers that I mentioned. And anytime those guys are on, whether it's a football game, a basketball game, whatever the case may be, I always enjoy watching and trying to take something new that they do that I feel I could implement it in my broadcasts.
You know, you talk about the economy of words and having to, or needing to play to your analyst so that, you're not talking on top of each other. I guess the extreme example of that would be Pat Summerall, who was the play-by-play guy who hardly a few words each play. And John Madden was his color commentator, and you know how Madden was in the booth. So they needed each other, and wow, that worked greatly. And of course, obviously, I'm segueing into how in the world do you get to be the voice of Madden football?
Well, it's something I never expected to be doing, and it's totally different from calling a real game. A lot of people think it's similar. It's not. It's basically you're a voice actor and recording those lines in a studio, reading off of a script. So it's totally different from sitting in the booth at Truist Park or sitting in a football stadium and calling a game where you're just reacting to what's going on. The Madden game is all about voice acting, and I really appreciate it because I've always had an itch to do voice acting and just acting in general, and been able to scratch that itch through this opportunity. But gosh, it was a previous life. I moved to Atlanta in 2013 to call games at Georgia Tech for their football and basketball team, and I was in my third and final season at Georgia Tech, and I'm sitting in the office, and I get this email through LinkedIn. And it says it's from a director of talent at EA Sports. Her first name was Marcy. And it was a message that said, we want to talk to you about an opportunity. And I honestly thought it was one of those spam messages that sometimes you get, like, okay, because I'm thinking, why would they reach out to me? What would EA Sports want to talk to me about? But I did reach back out to Marcy, and she said, before we have a real conversation, I need you to sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. And I'm thinking, what in the world? What could be so important that I need to sign an NDA, which I had never signed before? And then I get on the phone after signing the NDA with the Madden team, and one of the producers basically said, look, we're moving on from Jim Nantz and Phil Simms as our commentators on the game. And I heard one of your calls on SportsCenter a couple of months ago, and I looked into you and I've listened to some of your work, and we feel you may have a style and a voice that's going to work well on our video game. But they did caution me. They said, look, we're talking to about 10 other people. Everybody's going to come into audition. And so I was excited, but I didn't think a whole lot of it because I knew of whatever 10 guys they were bringing in that I was low on the totem pole. I knew that they were going to be bringing in some high-level people. But I went down to Orlando where they make the game to audition. And I remember the audition just went really well. It felt right. The script reading came pretty naturally. They seemed pleased. But I left there not thinking a whole lot of it. But then 2 months after that, and this is back in 2016 now, they called and I'll always remember where I was. I was here in Atlanta getting ready to walk into the gym to play pickup basketball with some friends. My phone rings and it's an Orlando area code. And I thought, well, this is probably the call one way or the other. And they said, we would like you to be the next play-by-play voice on Madden if you're interested. I said, yeah, I'm interested. That's one of those calls that I'll always remember. And I'm thankful to be able to still be doing it 8 years later with Charles Davis, who's a tremendous partner. And it's been a wonderful ride. Yeah.
How well did you shoot during that pickup basketball game right after you found out?
You know, I'm a point guard. I'm a distributor. I'm not a scorer, Ike. And I don't know if you can tell by my big stature, but I don't go in the post much. So maybe my passes were a little more crisp, but I wasn't hitting any deep threes that day. I never do.
Did your friends believe you? I mean, how did that go?
Well, I didn't. There was an embargo for 6 months where I couldn't tell anybody because they didn't want. They're so careful with that game. Not that people necessarily are focused on the commentary, but that game has become so global. I think they sell 7-8 million copies a year. And so with any piece of information, they embargo it. So with us, they were very strict. We had to sign a contract that we couldn't say anything about it until they officially released the new features on the following year's game. So I didn't tell anybody but my immediate family for 6 months, which was fine. What was the hardest part, honestly, is that I was traveling down to Orlando in secret to record lines. And my friends in Atlanta are like, man, you're going down to Orlando. Would you get a job at Disney? I'm like, no, I just got an opportunity down there. That was the hardest part, was all the travel and trying to lie to people about where I was going for those 6 months.
That's back. Madden was still alive at the time. Did he have anything to do with this process?
Yes. Not without. Well, he signed off on who the announcers were, but he basically, in his last decade, he was declining in health. They would go out to the Bay Area where he was, the Madden team, a few of them at the higher ups. They would sit with him in his basement, his man cave, as they called it, which, by the way, I saw a picture of it. It's unbelievable. But they would go out there, show him the new features on the game, and basically pitch the changes to him. And while he wasn't involved in the day-to-day, if he liked something, he would say, ooh, I like that, keep that, or nah, let's not do that. And so they viewed that pilgrimage out to his house as an opportunity to keep him involved. And also they just love to go and see him because he's such an icon. So he was involved before his death, but not at the level, obviously, that the producers and everybody making the game in Orlando were.
Yeah. One thing that stands out is you talking about John Madden's man cave, which I can imagine. I mean, he had years of designing his tour bus, since he didn't fly, that he probably could put together a pretty cool man cave.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, what is the toughest sport to call?
I don't know. I would say that football, I don't even know if tough is the right word. Football is the most involved because there are so many players. And one question that I get a lot that surprises people when I answer it is people assume that calling the NFL is harder than calling college. But NFL is a cakewalk compared to broadcasting college football. The challenges with college football are that you have 100 people on each roster. You have multiple jersey numbers that are the same. There will be injuries that they will not tell you about, and all of a sudden you'll think that the quarterback is starting and he's on the sideline and here's the backup, and you find out with the rest of the world. With the NFL, since it's a business, it is much more buttoned up. The rosters are obviously smaller, just over 50 players. The injury reports are transparent. The PR staffs are top-notch, and you know a lot of these players from watching them. So the NFL is it a challenge? Sure. But it is a lot easier for a broadcaster to prepare for and to call than the college game is. And football as a whole, because there's 22 guys out on the field at any given time, and the pace at which it moves is probably the most involved. You've got the most notes. It takes the longest to prepare for. If you've got a game on Saturday or Sunday, you're getting after it for the full week prior. With basketball, you've only got 10 guys out on the floor at the same time. You've got 12 players at most in a rotation. Usually it's 8 or 9. And so that prep is easier, but the challenge with basketball is it's lightning quick. Mm-hmm. And you got to work your analysts in, so you really have to be careful with your economy of words in basketball more so than the other sports. And then the last thing I would say, Ike, with baseball, that's just what I grew up on. There's a romance about broadcasting that game to me that just is special. It always has been special. It always will be special. Even with the pitch clock and shorter games, you still have time. You have time to let the game breathe, to listen to the organ. You have time to set up your analysts, to share deeper stories, and to go back and forth. That is harder with football and basketball. So that romance of baseball stole my heart when I was a kid, and it still has my heart all these years later now that I'm 40.
Yeah, don't let them ever get rid of that organ. And the Braves have a great organist,
They do. Matthew Kaminsky, he's phenomenal.
Another question along those lines is kind of silly, but I wanted to ask it anyway. Ever have a guy's name you just absolutely struggled to master?
It's funny. I had one Saturday for St. John's that haunted me that night because the first time I said it, I screwed it up and I swore that I wouldn't. And it's Owukuchu. And I don't remember which syllables I mixed up in there, but now I know it forever. But the first time I said it, I was like, oh, shoot, that came off my tongue wrong. And then I corrected it. Nobody, and I'm trying to think of stars that as they were coming up, if there was anybody I really struggled with, not really, nothing that comes to mind. But with what I will say now is that the basketball game and the football game, as they become more international sports, and obviously baseball's always had the Latin influence, right. But particularly with basketball and football, these sports information directors that kind of help you prepare for the game, their work is cut out for them because they always give you a pronunciation guide, and they're becoming longer and longer each and every year as the game becomes more international. And it's fun, and it should be that way, and it's great. But some of these guys' names, you just don't see them in America, and they're 5 or 6. They're really, really long, and so you've got to go into this game just really ready. And I write everything out phonetically so that I don't screw it up. But yeah, it's always a challenge, and it's a challenge though that I think is a fun one.
Oddly enough, I would say things as they were spelled because I came up in newspapers, and that has haunted me since I've moved over and done some podcast, as you can imagine, because on the copy desk at night at the newspaper, we and I'm not going to be able to think of an example, but if something's spelled funny, you would actually pronounce it like that to your mates, and just so that you remembered how to spell it. And that
Yep.
when that goes badly, it goes really badly. Well, I wanted to also bring up the news before I let you go. I could keep you all day, by the way, but we're gonna get to some news really quickly. Bally Sports, which is the name of the sports network that was at one time Fox Southeast, is now FanDuel Sports Network. Now, is that strictly branding, or will we see changes come with that?
As I understand it, and I'm really not trying to equivocate, I'm giving you what I know. It's business as usual. The color scheme has changed from red to blue. You'll see a different mic flag that says FanDuel instead of Bally. The employees, everybody that I work for and work with, everybody's the same. So, and for our purposes in the booth, nothing changes. We're still calling the game, the elements and the graphics and all of that the graphics may look a little different. They're a different color, but everything else about the nuance of the game is the same. And again, it's the same people in the broadcast truck. It's the same people operating the cameras. It's the same people in the office. So there's really no difference from that standpoint. And I will also say this, pretty lucky because the Braves front office has a good partnership with them. And the Braves front office, Derek Schiller, Alex Anthopoulos, Terry McGurk, could not ask for a better group of people. When I met with them last year before accepting the job, I told my dad this after I met with him. When I sat down with Derek Schiller and Alex Anthopoulos, it just felt like home. I was like, these guys get it. They're running this organization well. And I already love the Braves anyway, but after sitting down with them, I was like, gosh, this just feels right. So to have them, yes, FanDuel is the carrier of the TV side of things, and that's important. But you also have to realize the Braves front office is important in these TV rights as well, very much so. And having that group in place like the Braves do, it's comforting. Yeah. So, but for the fans watching, they're not really going to notice anything different other than a different color scheme.
Okay. All right. People are going to see that in the coming weeks and wonder whether or not they're going to lose their Braves broadcast. And I wanted to let them know about that. Like I said, Brandon, I could keep you all day, but I won't. I know you're busy. You got basketball. We're coming off of a football season. You do Braves baseball, and you're the voice of Madden. So these are the busy years, aren't they?
Yeah, you and I were joking before the show that they are busy years, but they are years. It's the old saying of love what you do and you don't work a day in your life, right? And my siblings got pictures of me broadcasting when I turned 30 with that inscription on the bottom. I've got it in my bedroom, and I just kind of take that mentality. So busy, but I don't have a wife or kids. So if that ever comes into play, then things will get really busy. We'll cross that bridge, though, Ike, if and when we get to it. So.
Well, God bless you, and have a great rest of your basketball season and Christmas season and all that we have ahead. We'll look forward to seeing you in the spring. Brandon Gaudin, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Ike, really appreciate you having me. Thank you. Happy holidays.
Folks, we're going to be back here bright and early in the morning. Until then, as always, y'all come on by and see what we're doing on the internet at al.com.